And now for something completely different. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much, Diana, and to Hourglass, and to the sponsors this evening. News about the Chesapeake Bay is often pessimistic, and I am sure many of you who live in Lancaster experience that with some frequency. I'd like to turn the tables on that tonight, though, and tell you a different story, and that's a story about optimism and hope. It's a story of a remarkable comeback, and one that's at the intersection of food and culture and the environment. The lead character in this story, I have to go for my prop now. The lead character in this story, I'm going to tell you something about this cool shell, is the lowly eastern oyster. Oh, I missed my slide there. Beautiful picture of the Chesapeake Bay. This is what oysters look like naturally, growing in the environment, and here's a single shell. Despite its size in my hand here, oysters once formed entire reefs that covered all of the Chesapeake, or most of the Chesapeake, and in fact, many coastal areas around the world. John Smith, believed to be the first European who sailed up the Chesapeake in 1610, drew this map, and in the logs about his voyage said his ships were frequently running aground on oyster reefs. Maybe they looked something like this. Now, before I go further in this story, I should say a few things about what makes this small creature just so amazing. First, they are indeed delicious. I think so. Maybe some of you don't. I don't know. We can cook them. They're also full of nutrients and a lot of protein. But one of the things about oysters beyond food is the services they provide to us, in addition to being an amazing food. As I mentioned, they form reefs. And those reefs can actually stop erosion, they can break wave energy, and they can serve as homes for other things that we like to eat, like this fish here, or crabs. One of my colleagues says that for a fish like this, an oyster reef is like a 5-star hotel with a fully stocked fridge. You may also have heard that oysters filter water. This is a picture from a partner of ours in Annapolis, Maryland, called the Oyster Recovery Partnership. So oysters, a single oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. They produce clean water by eating the stuff that causes the dead zones in the Chesapeake. And don't worry, they don't pass that on to us when we eat them. The filtration that oysters provide, though, really connects us all. You see, it's quite likely that the oyster that once occupied this shell, which I collected about 100 miles or so south of here, may have filtered water from the Conestoga River or from the Conneauga in Cumberland County, where I grew up fishing. And in doing so, that very oyster may have removed excess fertilizer that washed off my parents' lawn or off of a nearby farmer's field, and magically converted that back into nitrogen gas that went up into the atmosphere. I'm not a chemist, I don't profess to be one, I don't quite exactly understand how that works, but it is simply incredible. And it really demonstrates oysters' power, the power of nature. The challenge we face, though, is that for the past 3 centuries, we've harvested oysters like they didn't exist, and we haven't really managed them for those other benefits that we've talked about. To be clear, during that time, oysters provided us quite a lot. Their shells, look at the size of that. Those are people standing on piles of oyster shells. Those shells were a really important construction material for many cities in the early 1900s, for roadways, for sidewalks. They also helped employ thousands of people, shucking oysters, canning oysters. They were also helped to form the legendary waterman culture on the Chesapeake Bay. These are their skipjacks, their famous boat, which they dredged oysters with. They were also, speaking of providing, we talk about protein and protein sources. One of my colleagues who grew up in York told me that her mom ate oysters regularly. They were not a wealthy family. They probably bought large cans of oysters like this. So for millennia, oysters were a cheap, inexpensive, and common food source. They're not today. as we talked about. So the consequences of a really unchecked harvest for many, many, many years, combined with excess pollution coming into the bay from its rivers, combined with a couple of diseases, left us in a very precarious situation at the beginning of this century. In the early 2000s, wild oyster harvests had reached their lowest point ever, and many were clamoring for some sort of solution. And at that time, the governors of Maryland and Virginia thought it might be a good idea to introduce a non-native oyster, to bring an oyster that was from China, that we believed would be resistant to the diseases that were present in the Chesapeake, and introduce it. Thankfully, at that time, cooler heads prevailed and said, we're going to study this. We're going to look at it for a long time. Sorry, I skipped a slide. The problem that we were having in the Chesapeake was not unique to the Chesapeake. In fact, it's happened all over the planet. Oyster reefs are one of the most imperiled habitats. Back to the Chesapeake, this proposal to introduce a non-native oyster took 5 years, 5+ years of really deep study by universities, government agencies, nonprofits like ourselves, to really think about, is this a good idea? Is this really going to help us? And thankfully, in 2009, policymakers and politicians followed that science and decided not to introduce it, but instead to double down on our native oyster. It was truly a watershed moment that has led us down a really different path for the last 13 years. That path begins to reflect the true values that oysters provide to us as food, for sure, but also as a filter and as a food maker. At that time, state, federal agencies, nonprofits, universities, all committed to work together to restore reefs at really, really large scales, larger than we'd ever thought before. Did a lot of scientific work to understand how to best do that, and then invested in it and protected those reefs. We realized that oysters are critical infrastructure, just like bridges and roads, and that they require big construction efforts. This is a gentleman using a water cannon to blow shell and rock off of a boat in Virginia to build a new reef for oysters. Only a dozen years after potentially introducing a non-native oyster and being at the lowest point in our harvest, today we have the largest oyster reef restoration projects on the planet, 3 of which are larger than the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Just massive, incredible. The price tag is significant. I'm not going to lie to you about that, but we know it's smart. It's a smart investment. Documented benefits of filtration and fish production from those reefs that we've restored show that that investment pays for itself in less than a decade. It's truly a global success story. We've never restored oysters at this scale before, and people are visiting the Chesapeake from Europe, Asia, Australia, to see how they might do the same. You saw from that previous map that I showed just briefly how many oysters we've lost all over the planet, and they provide so many services to us. At the same time as these large oyster reefs were being rebuilt, changes in policy helped enable oyster farming to take root in around 2010 and start to grow. It's increased nearly tenfold in the past decade. Farming oysters is an alternative to traditional harvesting of wild oysters, and its emergence is part of a transformation in food production, creating sustainable jobs like Alex was talking about, and helping to regenerate the bay. It's proof, I think, that we can grow our food without harming other things that we care about at the same time. Entrepreneurs around the bay are trying farming. Some of them are from the city who I've met. Others are traditional watermen who want a more stable income source and perhaps more control over their harvests. So the resilience of the industry was really tested a couple of years ago with COVID, particularly the farmers that were selling direct to restaurants. Those restaurants shuttered and they were in real trouble. They immediately started to think differently, direct consumer sales to consumers. But also we were part of a program that was really exciting in that we raised some money and bought excess farmers that they couldn't sell and used them in restoration projects where they would perform all the good things that I was telling you about. This is one of our farmers, Scott Budden, who owns an oyster farm, actually on the left-hand side, planting his own oysters that he had grown in cages on a sanctuary reef near his farm that'll be there for hopefully at least 5 or 10 years, filtering water, reproducing, making new oysters. The good news is that this work is also helping that industry diversify for the future. It's helping build resilience by creating additional markets, markets for consumers, but also markets for the environment. And it begins to reflect the multiple values that they provide to us. So to be clear, we're not at the finish line of this story. We're certainly not all the way there. The oyster population is still a fraction of what it once was, and we have a lot of work to do still. But clearly there's hope, right? When I actually started doing this work, I've worked for the Nature Conservancy for 25 years. I've worked in Latin America, I've worked all over North America, but I started the work in the Chesapeake for us in the early 2000s, right as this proposal to introduce a non-native oyster came about. And during my short time, not even 15 years of doing this, we've seen a complete turnaround. It really gives me hope. We've built the largest oyster restoration projects on the planet. The farming industry is growing, and just last week, the wild fishery announced its largest harvest in 35 years. So you may, it's amazing. So we're sitting here in Lancaster County, and you may be thinking, why am I telling you this story? I think for two reasons. One, well, three reasons. Diana asked me to, and I couldn't say no. But also, as I said earlier, what happens here in Lancaster is connected to oysters downstream and vice versa. It's a really important symbiotic loop. But also because I believe that the factors over the last 15 or 20 years that led to the resurgence of oysters really is relevant to what's happening here in Lancaster with regards to agriculture, with regards to stormwater, anything that connects us where we live to the waters in our communities and the waters downstream like the Chesapeake. I boiled it down to three factors that I think are really important. The first is science. We have to know what we want and where we're going, and we have to be able to measure to see, are we on track to get there or not? If we hadn't invested in science with the non-native oyster question, I feel pretty strongly we might be trying to remove oysters from along the Atlantic seaboard right now. During that process, we found out that while we think that they were able to avoid the diseases that are native to the Chesapeake, they were going to bring other diseases, some of which were harmful to people. If we hadn't invested in that science, that might be happening right now. The second issue is collaboration, or the second factor for progress, I think, is collaboration. You can't do anything big by yourself. This is a picture from a number of us that were partners, different federal and state agencies, nonprofit organizations, some watermen that were involved in the restoration, the first big restoration project in Maryland. And I showed this picture up because it reminds me of what happened. We were ceremonially dumping that last bucket of oysters overboard. And we went back to shore, and there was a lot of press there, and they wanted to ask us about it. No one group said, we did it. Everybody pointed at everybody else and said, we did it together. It took a lot of hands, it took a lot of brains. And it just shows that big things take a lot of people and a lot of effort. My third and final factor is consistency. Achieving things takes a lot of people, it also takes a lot of time. Consistency of attention, of effort, of investment. This is a photo, the gentleman in the hat with the flag is the Maryland senator, state senator Bernie Fowler. He passed away last November at a very old age, and thankfully. Senator Fowler was a state legislator. I had the privilege to meet him once, and he was a state senator, but he was also a farmer, and he was a really, really strong advocate for the river that his farm was adjacent to. And for more than 30 years, he led an annual event called a wade-in, where he walked with people hand in hand to see how far he could walk out into the water until his white Converse sneakers disappeared. And he measured that every year. That's consistency of effort. It was a demonstration of consistency and what he really cared about. And he motivated a lot of people along the way. His mantra, which lives on, is never, never, never give up. As I said, we're not at the end of this oyster story, but so far, I hope you'll agree with me that it's pretty incredible. I hope it inspires you to believe that with science, collaboration, and consistency, we can actually really achieve incredible things together. Thanks.